is 44. My son refused to answer my calls for 25 days. So I passed my legacy to his sister and watched him fade into nothing. This is my story. I am an old man now, but I still remember the pain as if it was yesterday. My only son, the one I worked for, the one I trusted, refused to answer my calls for 25 long days. Each day felt like a wound cutting deeper. I waited, hoping, but he never came back to me. That silence broke me, but it also gave me strength. I passed my legacy to his sister and left him with nothing. Before I share the full story, tell me where you are watching from, and please subscribe. I was not born into wealth. My life began in a small house with walls that cracked when the rains came and a roof that leaked more than it covered. My father worked as a farmer, my mother stayed at home, and we had just enough food to survive. I grew up knowing the taste of hunger, the sting of cold nights, and the endless ache of tired bones. But when my son was born, I swore he would never know the same. From the moment I held him in my arms, I promised myself that I would give him a life better than the one I had. I knew it would cost me everything, but I was ready. My heart had only one goal: his happiness, his future, his success. I worked through sickness, storms, and exhaustion. Even when fever burned my body, I would rise before the sun and leave for work. I labored in fields, carried loads, built roads, and sometimes took jobs that broke my back. My hands were cut, my skin was burnt by the sun, and my clothes were torn. But I kept going because every coin I earned was for him. When I felt hunger, I saved the food for him. When I needed rest, I pushed through because I wanted him to sleep in comfort. There were days when I had only a handful of rice for myself, but I saved the little meat or milk for him. I told myself, if I must suffer, let it be me, not him. I remember nights when he was still a child, coughing in the dark. I carried him on my back, walking for miles to the nearest doctor because I could not afford transport. My legs shook, my chest burned, but I did not stop. I whispered to myself that I would give my last breath if it meant keeping him alive. I spent money on his medicine, even when it meant I had none for myself. I cut my own needs away piece by piece so he could have a chance. Every storm I faced, I carried his face in my mind. When the rain poured, I worked in mud, thinking of the shoes I would buy him. When the sun burned, I stayed in the fields, thinking of the books he would need for school. When I was offered a chance to spend money for myself, I refused because I had a bigger dream. My son would never go hungry, never sit in the dark, never beg for coins the way I once did. I saved every coin in an old metal box. Each coin represented a drop of sweat, a missed meal, a night of pain. I never told him how much I struggled because I wanted him to feel like his life was easy. I wanted him to think the world was safe, even though I knew it was not. My sacrifices were silent, but they were heavy. And every day I thought, one day he will look at me and say, "Father, I see what you have done." As he grew older, I invested everything in his education. I bought books I could not read, paid school fees with money I did not have, and worked double shifts so he could wear a clean uniform. While other men drank after work, I worked. While other men rested on Sundays, I took extra jobs. My body ached for years, but I never complained. I told myself that his future was my only reward. I believed love would return in respect. I believed that one day he would stand beside me, proud of me, and carry my name with honor. I thought he would take care of me the way I took care of him. I thought my sacrifices would not be forgotten. My love for him was so deep that I never considered the possibility of betrayal. I thought blood was stronger than anything. I thought a son could never turn away from the man who gave him life. I was wrong, but at that time, I did not know. At that time, I still lived for him. Every decision, every choice, every breath was for him. When I bought land, I thought of his future. When I built a small house, I thought of the family he would raise inside it. When I saved money, I told myself it was for his security. My name, my work, my sweat, my heart, everything was meant to be his. And yet, in the end, all of it meant nothing to him. The first time I called him, I thought he was busy. It was a normal day. I sat in my chair, holding the phone, waiting to hear his voice. I let it ring, long and steady, but it went unanswered. I told myself, he must be at work. He must be tired. He will call me back. I placed the phone down gently, with patience in my heart. I had no anger, no worry, only hope. I thought he would see the missed call and return it. But the next day came, and I called again. Still, no answer. The sound of the ringing filled my small room. It echoed in the silence of my house. I stared at the walls while it rang, waiting, hoping, praying. Each second felt longer than the last. When the ringing ended, I sat still, holding the phone in my hand, listening to the emptiness that followed. My heart sank a little, but I tried to believe he was simply occupied. On the third day, I called again. I pressed his number slowly, carefully, as if pressing the right way would bring him to me. I listened to the ringing, felt the cold metal of the phone in my palm, and imagined his face. I thought maybe he was too busy to answer, but surely he would call me when he saw 3 missed calls from his father. I waited all day, sitting by the window, but no call came. The sun went down, the night grew deep, and I was still alone with silence. Days began to blend into each other. I called in the morning, I called at noon, I called at night. Each time, no answer, no voice, no reply. The phone became heavier in my hand, as if the silence itself was pressing down on me. I left messages too, small words, simple words, words from a father's heart. But the messages were never read. They sat in the dark, ignored, just like me. I started to notice the weight of time. The clock on the wall ticked louder with each passing day. I sat and watched it, waiting for the hour when he might call me back. But the hours passed, the hands moved, and nothing changed. I began to measure my life not by food, not by sleep, but by unanswered calls. Morning, noon, and night. Each one became a reminder that my son had no place for me in his world. Neighbors came to me sometimes, asking about him. They asked, "How is your son? Does he visit? Does he call?" I forced a smile, but my heart sank lower every time. I had no answer to give. I had no words to cover the truth. I could only nod, say little, and change the subject. Inside, I burned with shame. How could I explain that the boy I raised, the boy I gave my life for, would not even pick up the phone? My nights grew longer. I would place the phone beside my bed, hoping to hear its ring in the darkness. I kept the light on, waiting for the moment when his name would flash across the screen. But the nights were only filled with silence. The only sound was the beating of my own heart and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Each night I told myself, tomorrow he will call. Each morning proved me wrong. The silence was not empty. It was heavy. It pressed on my chest, made breathing harder, made my bones feel older. It was louder than words. It told me something I did not want to believe. It told me that my son had forgotten me. It told me that the man I raised, the child I once carried on my back, had no space for me in his life. Every time I dialed his number, my hand trembled. My chest tightened as the ringing started. I whispered inside myself, begging for him to answer. But the ringing always ended the same way, with nothing, with silence, with rejection. It was a wound that reopened every single day. I sat in my chair, staring at the phone, staring at the door, waiting for something that never came, waiting for love, waiting for care, waiting for a son who had abandoned his father. And as the days went on, the silence grew louder than any argument, louder than any fight, louder than any words could ever be. This was the beginning of my pain. Not an explosion, not a scream, not a final goodbye. Just silence. Long, cold, endless silence. And it cut deeper than any knife could. The first day of silence felt strange. A father can excuse one missed call. He thought his son was busy at work or caught in some important matter. He sat in his chair by the window, holding the phone close, waiting for it to light up. Each time it rang, it was someone else, not his son. He smiled through the disappointment, whispering to himself that tomorrow would be different. The second day came and passed, and still there was no reply. The phone sat heavy on the table. The father's heart grew heavy too, but he kept faith. A son would not ignore the voice of the man who raised him. Surely he would call back soon. On the third day, the silence felt louder. The walls of the house echoed with it. The father dialed again, listening to the endless rings. Each tone was like a knock on a closed door. He spoke into the air as if his son could hear him, but only the buzzing tone answered. He placed the phone back down gently, as though careful handling could bring kindness back. The fourth day turned into the fifth, then the sixth, and still no reply. Neighbors stopped by, asking if he had spoken to his son. He forced a smile and said he must be very busy. But when the neighbors left, he sat alone and stared at the silent screen. The silence hurt more than words could. It was not just the absence of sound. It was the absence of care. On the seventh day, he left a message. His voice cracked as he tried to keep steady. He asked if his son was well, if everything was all right, if he had perhaps done something wrong. He begged for just a single word back, but the message went unanswered. The eighth day arrived with rain. The drops on the roof matched the beating of his heart. He watched the water run down the glass, waiting for his phone to ring. It never did. He made tea and sat with it growing cold beside him. Each sip tasted of loneliness. On the ninth day, he tried again. His fingers trembled as he pressed the numbers. He prayed his son would pick up, that he would hear his voice. But again, only silence met him. The phone rang and rang until it stopped. He felt as if the world itself had turned away. On the 10th day, the pain deepened. 10 days without a word from a child he had raised with his own hands. He remembered the nights when his son was a baby, crying in the dark. He would rise, tired from work, and rock him until he slept. Now, years later, the same child refused to answer even one call. On the 11th day, he tried to distract himself. He walked through the fields, looked at the sky, and listened to the birds. But even in nature's sounds, he heard only silence. The phone remained in his pocket, cold and lifeless. Each vibration from the wind fooled him into hope. Each time, it was nothing. On the 12th day, he grew weaker. Sleep escaped him. Food tasted bitter. His mind replayed the same question. Why? Why would his son ignore him for so long? Had he not given everything? Had he not sacrificed his life for him? The weight of betrayal pressed harder than age itself. On the 13th day, he left another message. This time, his words carried sorrow more than hope. He told his son that he missed him, that the house felt empty, that his heart was growing tired. But once again, there was no reply. On the 14th day, the silence became a wound. He tried to hide it, but it showed in his eyes, in his steps, in the way he carried himself. Neighbors noticed his silence and asked again if all was well. He only nodded. He could not bear to say the truth aloud. On the 15th day, half a month had gone. Half a month without a single word. He sat in the chair where his wife once sat, remembering how she used to remind him that children grow distant, but never truly leave. Yet here he was, abandoned in his old age. On the 16th day, his hands shook more than usual. He struggled to hold the phone steady as he dialed. The same silence answered. He closed his eyes and let the phone fall to the table. The thud was soft, but inside him it felt like thunder. On the 17th day, he did not try to call. His spirit was weak. He sat by the window and watched the world move on without him. He wondered if his son even thought of him at all. On the 18th day, the loneliness deepened. He wandered through the house, touching the walls he had built with his bare hands. Each brick held a memory of his labor, his devotion, his sacrifice. And yet the one he built it for had turned away. On the 19th day, he tried to eat with neighbors, but their laughter only reminded him of what he lacked. He excused himself early and returned home. He stared at the phone until he fell asleep in his chair. On the 20th day, he awoke with a start. He had dreamt of his son as a boy, smiling, calling for him. He reached out in the dream, but woke to silence. Tears came without warning. He wiped them away quickly, ashamed of them. On the 21st day, he tried once more. He spoke into the voicemail with a trembling voice. He told his son that he loved him, no matter what, that he would always be there. But deep down, he knew the message would be unheard. On the 22nd day, whispers reached him. People spoke of his son's success, of his busy life, of his rising status. They praised him for his ambition. The father only lowered his head. They did not know the truth. They did not know the silence. On the 23rd day, he sat outside as the sun went down. The sky burned with red, but inside, he felt only gray. He clutched the phone in his hands, as if squeezing it could draw his son closer. It remained cold and unyielding. On the 24th day, he gave up calling. The silence had spoken louder than words ever could. He sat in his chair, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of 24 days without his son's voice. He realized the bond was broken, perhaps forever. On the 25th day, the truth struck. 25 days had passed. Not one call, not one reply, not one word. The silence was not an accident. It was a choice. His son had chosen to abandon him. The father sat in the stillness of his home, his heart heavy with the knowledge. The silence was not empty. It was filled with betrayal. The ticking of the clock grew louder, each second mocking him. The house, once built with love, now echoed with loneliness. He lowered his head, and in that moment, he understood. The son he had raised with his sweat, his hunger, his pain, and his love, had left him behind. 25 days of silence had told the story louder than any words could. The silence of 25 days did not end with the passing of time. It stayed, clinging to the old man's heart like a heavy stone. Now, in the emptiness of his home, he found himself reflecting on the long journey of his life. He sat in the same chair where he had waited for his son's call, but this time he no longer reached for the phone. Instead, he reached inward, into the memories that shaped his years. Each thought was sharp, cutting deeper than the silence itself. Loneliness had become his only companion. The house he built with his own hands stood around him like a witness. Every wall carried the mark of his sacrifice. He remembered mixing cement under the hot sun, laying bricks while sweat poured down his face, pushing his tired body long past its limit so that his son would never lack a roof. That house was not built for himself. It was built for his son's future, for his safety, for his pride. Now, the same walls seemed to mock him, echoing with the absence of the very child he built it for. He walked slowly from room to room, his fingers brushing against the doors, the windows, the furniture. Each item carried a story, a memory. The bed where his son once slept as a boy, the table where they once shared meals, the corner where his son once left his school bag. All of it remained, but the boy had grown into a man who no longer cared. The father felt the weight of years pressing down on his back, but heavier still was the weight of betrayal. Nights were the hardest. In the darkness, his thoughts grew louder. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and replayed the years of sacrifice. He remembered the nights he stayed awake, working extra hours to earn enough for school fees. He remembered walking miles in the rain to bring food home. He remembered going hungry so his son could eat. All those memories returned, not as moments of pride, but as reminders of how little they had been valued. His loneliness spoke to him more than any words could. It whispered that all his sacrifices had been forgotten. It told him that love had been one-sided. He thought about his wife, long gone, and how she had once reassured him that their son would care for him in his old age. He had believed her. Now he sat alone, the promise broken, the bond shattered. Loneliness became a mirror, showing him the truth he had avoided for years. He had given everything, but received nothing in return. In those nights of reflection, he also remembered the small joys of the past. The way his son once laughed when he lifted him onto his shoulders, the way his little hand once held his. Those moments once gave him strength, but now they gave him sorrow. Because the child who once needed him had grown into a man who no longer cared whether he lived or died. The silence of the present turned those sweet memories bitter. He realized that love, when not respected, becomes a wound. Each reflection deepened his understanding. Silence was not only the absence of words, it was the presence of truth. His son's refusal to call was not a mistake, not an accident. It was a decision. And in that decision, the father saw his place in his son's heart, a place of neglect, a place of abandonment. The loneliness of the father became a teacher. It showed him that loyalty cannot be forced. It showed him that respect cannot be demanded. It must be given freely. And when it is not given, silence grows into betrayal. Each day of loneliness carved these lessons deeper into his soul. He sat with them, accepted them, and let them change him. He no longer waited for the phone to ring. Instead, he waited for his own courage to rise. Reflection gave him clarity. He realized he had mistaken silence for patience, neglect for busyness, and betrayal for misunderstanding. Now he saw it clearly. His son's silence was not about time. It was about love. Love that was missing. Love that had died. The father's loneliness also brought him strength. As he sat alone, he understood that he could no longer protect his son's place in his heart with excuses. To do so would be to betray himself. For years, he had endured small wounds of disrespect, telling himself they were only temporary. But now, with 25 days of silence behind him, he knew the truth. His son had chosen a different path, a path without him. That knowledge was painful, but it was also freeing. Reflection in loneliness showed him that love must be answered with love. Sacrifice must be honored with respect. Where there is none, there can be no bond. The father felt his heart ache, but he also felt his resolve grow. He told himself that silence would no longer define him. His dignity mattered too. His sacrifices mattered. His life mattered. He could not let his son's neglect erase all that he had built, all that he had endured. He would not allow his years of struggle to be buried in silence. As he sat alone, the loneliness sharpened his decision. He understood that action must follow reflection. The silence had taught him all he needed to know. The son who ignored him for 25 days had already cut himself off. Now, the father would finish what the silence had started. The 25 days of silence had turned from a wound into a lesson, and the lesson had turned into a truth. The father could no longer hide from it. He sat in his chair, feeling the heaviness of years on his shoulders, and realized that his life had reached a turning point. Reflection had shown him the pain of neglect, but reflection alone was not enough. Pain without action only deepens. Truth without decision only fades. Now came the time for choice. He looked around his house, the house built with his sweat and years of struggle. Every brick had cost him something: his strength, his comfort, his health. He had carried loads that bent his back. He had worked nights that stole his sleep. He had gone without food so that his son could eat. That house was not just walls and a roof. It was his blood turned into stone, his tears turned into shelter. But as he walked through its rooms, he saw it no longer as a gift for his son. He saw it as a memory of betrayal. It was a monument of love that had been thrown away. The silence of his son had stripped the house of its purpose. What good was a home if the one it was built for no longer cared about the man who made it? The father's decision began to grow from this thought. He knew he could not allow the fruit of his labor to go to someone who would treat him like a burden. He could not give away his last gift to a heart that had no gratitude. His sacrifices were not worthless, and they would not be wasted. If his son could throw away 25 days without a thought for his father, then his father could throw away the inheritance that was once promised. The son had chosen silence. The father would now choose consequence. Each night, the decision became clearer. At first, it frightened him. For years, he had believed that a father's duty was to provide until his last breath. But now he understood that duty cannot survive without respect. A bond cannot stand on one side alone. To keep giving when the other side does not care is not duty, it is self-destruction. And he had already destroyed too much of himself for the sake of a son who could not even pick up the phone. So he rose one morning, older than his years, but steadier than before, and walked to the table where the papers were kept. The documents of inheritance lay waiting. His trembling fingers touched them, not with weakness, but with finality. Those papers once represented hope. Now they would represent his decision. He decided that his son would no longer be the heir to his legacy. The inheritance would no longer be a reward for neglect. It would no longer be the property of someone who could let 25 days pass as if his father's life had no meaning. The decision was not born from anger. It was born from dignity. He did not want revenge. He wanted justice. For his sacrifices, for his years, for his love. He wanted the truth of his son's silence to be written into action. If the son could live without the father, then the father could plan without the son. The decision was simple in words, but heavy in weight. It was the closing of a chapter, the end of a bond that had been stretched until it broke. The father also thought about what his son might feel when the decision was revealed. Perhaps anger, perhaps regret, perhaps nothing at all. But that no longer mattered. The silence of 25 days had already answered every question. If his son could not value his father's life, then he did not deserve his father's legacy. The father had carried guilt for too long, excusing every slight, ignoring every wound, forgiving every neglect. But now, for the first time, he chose himself. He chose his worth. He chose to honor his years of sacrifice by placing them in the hands of someone who would respect them. As he signed his decision into paper, he felt the pen shake slightly. Not because of fear, but because of the weight of history. Every stroke of ink carried the memory of nights he had worked without sleep, of days he had gone without comfort, of years he had given his strength, and now those strokes of ink were cutting his son out of his future. It was painful, but it was necessary. Love without respect is poison, and he had swallowed enough of it already. After the decision was made, a strange calm entered his heart. The silence that had once tortured him now seemed lighter. It no longer pressed against him like a stone. Instead, it felt like a boundary he had built around his dignity. His son's voice was still absent, but it no longer mattered. The father had spoken through action. He had turned silence into consequence. The decision was his voice, and it was louder than any words he could have spoken. He sat in the same chair where he had once waited for a call, but this time he did not wait. He did not look at the phone. He did not hope for the sound of ringing. He simply sat with his decision, firm and unshaken. For the first time in years, he felt like his life was his own again. He had given enough away. Now he would keep what was his. The inheritance that was once meant to pass to his son would now pass elsewhere, to someone who would understand its value. His son had lost not just property, but history, sacrifice, and trust. That was the price of silence. The father understood that the world might judge him. Some might say he was harsh. Some might say a father should forgive endlessly. But those people had not lived through 25 days of silence. They had not given every piece of their body and soul, only to be treated as if they did not exist. Forgiveness without respect is slavery, and he had broken those chains. The decision was not cruelty. It was freedom. And so, with the decision sealed, he rose from his chair. His back was bent, his hair gray, his face lined with years of struggle. But inside, he felt taller than ever. He had chosen dignity over neglect, truth over illusion, action over silence. The father who once waited like a beggar for his son's love now stood like a man who finally knew his own worth. His decision was final, and with it, he found peace. When the decision was made, the father knew that the weight of his choice would not remain silent inside papers and signatures. It needed to be carried forward by someone who would honor it. His heart, which had been bruised by neglect, now searched for a vessel of trust. And that vessel was his daughter. She was the one who had not turned her back. She was the one who still remembered that love flows both ways. The father looked at her not as a replacement, but as the rightful bearer of his years, his labor, and his legacy. When the daughter first heard of the decision, her eyes filled with tears. They were not tears of greed or triumph. They were tears of gratitude, heavy with the weight of responsibility. She knew her father's pain. She had watched the silence of her brother turn into nights of waiting. She had seen the old man sit by the phone, holding it as though it might one day ring. She knew the betrayal that lay hidden behind his calm face. And so, when the inheritance was handed to her, she did not see it as wealth. She saw it as trust. She saw it as a lifetime of sacrifice placed in her hands. The daughter promised herself that the story of her father's struggles would not be forgotten. Every coin he had saved, every hour he had worked, every drop of sweat he had shed would live on in her care. She would guard his memory with respect, not waste it in silence. Where her brother had turned his back, she would face forward. Where her brother had chosen pride, she would choose loyalty. The legacy, once thought to belong to the son, now found a more faithful heart in the daughter. The father saw this difference clearly. It was like night and day. His son had treated love as a burden, but his daughter treated it as a gift. His son had treated inheritance as something owed, but his daughter treated it as something entrusted. That contrast made the father's decision feel even more right. It showed him that his sacrifices were not wasted, for at least one child understood their meaning. It gave him relief to know that his name would not be carried by silence, but by loyalty. The daughter became the rightful carrier of the family's story. She was not just receiving land, property, or money. She was receiving a father's heart. She was receiving the proof of years that had gone before her. She was receiving the history of hardship that had built everything she now touched. And she received it not with arrogance, but with humility. Her loyalty shone like a flame in a dark room, reminding the father that not all bonds break, not all children forget. The father thought about what his daughter's role meant for the future. He imagined her walking through the house he had built, not as a stranger, but as a keeper. He imagined her carrying the stories he once told, not letting them fade into dust. He imagined her children, his grandchildren, growing up knowing where they came from, knowing the value of sweat and sacrifice. The daughter would not let those stories vanish. She would hold them close, the way she had held her father's hand through the years. This role was not easy for her. She knew that her brother's shadow would always hang over the decision. She knew that some would accuse her of stealing, of taking what was not hers. But she also knew the truth. She knew that silence is not loyalty, and neglect is not love. She knew that her father had chosen her not because she asked, but because she gave time, care, and respect. She knew that her role was not a prize, but a duty, and she was ready to carry it. Her acceptance of this role brought comfort to the father. For years, he had feared dying with his sacrifices forgotten. But now, he knew they would live on. His daughter would keep them alive. His years would not fade into nothing. His name would not be erased by silence. Instead, it would be carried forward by a daughter whose heart still beat in rhythm with his. This was the reward of loyalty, the answer to betrayal. The father realized something deeper, too. The decision to pass his legacy to his daughter was not only about inheritance, it was about truth. It was about rewriting the story of his family. For too long, he had believed that a son must always inherit. But love is not tied to gender. Love is tied to respect. Loyalty is not bound by tradition. It is bound by action. His daughter had shown more loyalty than his son ever had. And so she became the rightful heir, not because of blood alone, but because of love. As the days passed, the daughter began to step into her role. She took responsibility with quiet strength. She listened to her father's instructions, not with impatience, but with care. She asked about his life, his struggles, his dreams, because she wanted to understand what she was carrying. She treated every detail as important. She treated every memory as sacred. And as the father watched her, his heart softened. He had been hardened by silence. but now he was healed by loyalty. This loyalty made the father stronger in his old age. He no longer felt invisible. He no longer felt like a burden. His daughter's presence reminded him that he mattered, that his sacrifices had meaning. She gave him what his son could not, the simple gift of being seen. And because of that, the legacy felt secure in her hands. He no longer worried about what would happen when he was gone. He no longer feared being erased. His daughter would keep him alive, not in silence, but in remembrance. Thus, the daughter's role was not just about inheritance. It was about healing. It was about turning the pain of betrayal into the strength of loyalty. It was about showing that love can still exist, even when silence has tried to kill it. The father, once broken by neglect, now stood supported by gratitude. The daughter's tears had washed away years of loneliness. Her loyalty had built a bridge where her brother had left a void. She became not just an heir, but a guardian. She was the one who would carry the torch. She was the one who would prove that sacrifice does not always fall into ungrateful hands. She was the one who showed that even when a son fades into nothing, a daughter can rise into everything. The day of the family gathering came like any other day, yet it carried a weight that no ordinary day could hold. The father prepared himself not with joy, but with a heavy calmness. He knew that the truth he was about to share would change the way his family saw each other. He knew it would reveal where loyalty lived and where betrayal hid. He had carried this decision inside for weeks, like a stone pressing on his chest. Now the time had come to let it fall, to let it rest in the open where no silence could cover it. The house that had once echoed with laughter now felt like a stage of truth. The chairs were lined, the table set, the family gathered one by one. They came in with smiles, with greetings, with voices that did not yet know what was waiting for them. The father looked at them quietly, his old eyes taking in each face. He saw his brothers, his cousins, his grandchildren. He saw his daughter standing close, steady and calm, carrying the knowledge of what was to come. But one face was missing, the son's. The chair meant for him remained empty. It was not empty by accident. It was empty by choice. That empty chair spoke louder than any voice. It reminded everyone of the 25 days of silence, the unanswered calls, the messages left to die unread. The father stared at it for a long time, feeling both pain and clarity. The absence of his son was not just a moment. It was a pattern. It was the truth made visible. And so, when he rose to speak, he looked first at that chair and then at the faces around the table. The room grew still. Every whisper stopped. Every fork was set down. The family could feel that what was about to be said was not light. The father's voice, though old, carried the strength of years. He did not speak with anger. He spoke with the weight of truth. He told them that for 25 days he had called his son. For 25 days he had waited for a voice that never came. For 25 days he had been abandoned, not by strangers, but by his own blood. He told them that silence had spoken louder than words, and that he had listened. Then he revealed the decision. He said that his legacy, his inheritance, his property, and his years of sacrifice would no longer belong to the son who turned away. It would now belong to the daughter who remained. His daughter who had not abandoned him. His daughter who had stood by him when the phone never rang. His daughter who understood that love is not owed, but given. The words fell heavy, each one shaping a new reality. The silence that followed was deep. The family looked at each other with wide eyes. Some lowered their heads, too shocked to speak. Others glanced at the empty chair, as if expecting the son to appear and defend himself. But he was not there. He had chosen not to be there. And so, the truth stood unchallenged, the air thick with its weight. The father's words carried no bitterness, only clarity. He was not punishing. He was not seeking revenge. He was simply placing his legacy where loyalty lived. For the daughter, standing by her father's side, the moment was overwhelming. She felt the weight of every eye in the room. She knew some would judge her, some would envy her, some would call it unfair. But she also knew the truth. She knew the long nights of waiting. She knew the quiet pain her father carried. She knew that loyalty had been tested, and only she had remained. And so, though her hands trembled, her heart was steady. She received her father's decision not as a prize, but as a duty. The father looked at the faces again. He saw disappointment in some, surprise in others, but also understanding in a few. His brothers nodded slowly, as if to say they had seen enough of life to know that love cannot be forced. His cousins whispered, their voices low but filled with curiosity. His grandchildren stared in silence, too young to understand fully, but sensing the heaviness of the moment. And still, that empty chair sat in the corner, a reminder of the one who chose absence over presence. The weight of shame now belonged to that chair. It was as if the entire room looked at it and saw the son's betrayal. They saw not a missing man, but a missing heart. They saw not an empty seat, but an empty bond. And though the son was not there, his absence became louder than any protest could have been. The silence of his neglect was now exposed before everyone. The father sat down again, his voice no longer needed. The truth had been spoken. The decision had been made. There was nothing more to argue, nothing more to explain. The family could feel that the old man was not seeking pity. He was seeking peace. He had chosen peace not in silence, but in truth. His daughter had been lifted, his son had been erased, and his legacy had been redirected. It was a revelation not of anger, but of justice. Some in the family began to whisper to each other, asking how such a thing could happen. How could a son lose everything? How could a daughter be chosen over him? The father heard their whispers, but he did not answer. He knew the truth would answer for him. He knew that one day, when the son learned of this moment, shame would sit heavier on him than any punishment. He knew that neglect always has a price, and that price had now been paid in full. For the daughter, the gathering was both a burden and a blessing. She knew her father's love had been confirmed, but she also knew her brother's absence would haunt her. She would carry not only the inheritance, but also the story of why it was hers. Every time she looked at the house, the land, or the papers, she would remember that they came not through tradition, but through betrayal. And yet she accepted it, because she knew the truth mattered more than appearances. The revelation spread beyond the walls of that room. Family members told others, and soon the story became known in the larger circle. People spoke of how the father had stripped his son of everything. They spoke of how the daughter had been chosen instead. Some saw it as justice, others as tragedy. But no matter how they saw it, the truth remained unchanged. The son had abandoned, the father had acted, and the daughter had inherited. In the father's heart, the revelation was not about shame, but about healing. By speaking the truth aloud, he had freed himself from the prison of silence. By declaring his decision openly, he had made it real, unchangeable, and final. He no longer feared dying with his wishes ignored. He no longer feared his sacrifices being wasted. His family now knew the truth, and the truth would stand when he was gone. And so, the revelation was more than an announcement. It was a turning point. It was the moment where silence lost its power, and loyalty was crowned. It was the moment where a son's absence became his downfall, and a daughter's presence became her rise. It was the moment where an old man, broken by neglect, found peace in truth. When the son finally returned, the air around him carried no warmth, no welcome. He walked into the house he once believed was his future, but he did not know that the future had already slipped from his hands. His steps were heavy, his pride still strong, but his power already gone. He entered with the same arrogance he had carried before, believing time had erased the silence he had left behind. But time had not erased it. Time had carved it deeper. For 25 days, the father had waited by the phone. For 25 days, the father had been ignored. And for those same days, the son had lived as if his father did not exist. Now he returned not to love, but to judgment. The first thing he noticed was the change in the air. The family's voices grew quieter when he appeared. Their eyes shifted, not with admiration, but with unease. His sister, standing near the father, held papers in her hand that he did not yet understand. She looked at him not with envy, not with anger, but with a kind of steady strength he had never seen before. He searched the room for comfort, for someone to greet him, but found only silence. The chair he thought belonged to him was already filled, not by him, but by the truth he had abandoned. When his father looked at him, the son felt something he had never felt before. It was not the soft gaze of a forgiving parent. It was not the weary eyes of a man hoping for change. It was a gaze stripped of illusion, stripped of hope. It was the gaze of truth. The father did not rise to greet him. He did not call his name. He simply looked, and in that look the son felt the weight of everything he had thrown away. Then the papers were shown. The daughter held them gently, as if holding both her father's heart and his will. The father explained calmly, with no anger in his voice, that his son had been cut from the legacy. Every property, every coin, every memory built from sacrifice now belonged to the daughter. The son, who once thought the future was his by right, was now left with nothing. The words struck him like a storm, and yet no one moved to shield him. The family murmured softly. Some looked at the son with pity, others with disappointment, but none with support. They had heard the truth already. They had witnessed the revelation at the last gathering. They knew the father's pain, and they knew the son's silence. Now they watched as pride crumbled into dust before their eyes. The son's face turned pale, his lips trembling not with apology, but with shock. He could not believe it, yet the proof was in his sister's hands. For years he had mocked his father's patience, believing it to be weakness. For years he had dismissed traditions, thinking himself greater than the roots that held him. For years he believed inheritance was his by birth, not by loyalty. But in this moment he saw how quickly pride can collapse. He saw how silence can destroy more than words. He saw how absence can erase a man from his own family. The weight of his arrogance fell on him like chains, and there was no key left to unlock them. His sister did not boast. She did not gloat. She stood silently, carrying the weight of loyalty on her shoulders. Her eyes did not seek his, for she knew he would see them as victory. But this was not victory. This was justice. This was the truth being written on paper, signed by hands that remembered sacrifice and carried respect. She stood as the chosen heir, not because she demanded it, but because her brother abandoned it. The son looked around the room, desperate for someone to speak for him, but no one did. The uncles remained silent. The cousins looked away. The grandchildren, though young, understood that something had broken. They had seen their grandfather wait by the phone. They had seen his quiet pain. Now they saw his justice, and even their innocence knew it was fair. The son had no defender, because neglect cannot be defended. Silence cannot be excused. Betrayal cannot be hidden. The old man, the father, watched his son closely. He did not smile. He did not cry. He simply sat with dignity. He had endured too much to seek joy in this moment. It was not about revenge. It was about balance. It was about putting the weight where it belonged. He had given love, and love had been returned by one child and abandoned by the other. He had given sacrifice, and sacrifice had been remembered by one child and mocked by the other. Now the scales were even. Now the truth was settled. The son tried to speak, but his words failed him. His throat burned, his chest tightened. Every word he wanted to say sounded small compared to the truth already known. What could he say? That he had been busy? That he had forgotten? That his father was not worth the call? None of those excuses could survive in that room. None of them could erase the 25 days of silence. None of them could restore the legacy he had lost. His voice, once filled with arrogance, was now filled with emptiness. The room remained silent, but the silence now belonged to him. It was his punishment, his burden. The father no longer carried it. The daughter no longer feared it. The family no longer questioned it. The silence was his, and it would follow him for the rest of his life. He had left his father waiting in silence, and now silence had returned to claim him. As the truth sank deeper, the son's pride dissolved. He looked at his sister, at the papers in her hand, at the family around him, and at the father who no longer saw him as heir. He realized he was not only cut from inheritance, but from dignity. He realized his name would not carry forward through property or land, but through shame. He realized that while his sister's children would walk through the fields of their grandfather, his own children would carry nothing but the memory of his silence. The fallout was complete. There was no anger left to burn, no forgiveness left to offer. Only truth remained. The son stood powerless, stripped of everything he thought was his. His father's dignity filled the room, shining brighter than wealth. His sister's loyalty stood firm, stronger than pride. The family's silence became judgment, sharper than words. And the son, once filled with arrogance, was left standing alone in the ruins of his own making. The father breathed deeply, not with triumph, but with peace. He had carried the weight of betrayal for too long. Now, the truth had spoken. His dignity was restored. His legacy was safe. His son's arrogance had fallen. The fallout was not loud. It was not violent. It was silent, steady, final. And in that silence, the old man found peace at last. After the truth had been spoken, after the room had fallen silent and the papers had been signed, the old man stood quietly. He did not speak again that evening. He did not look at his son. He did not explain further. There was nothing left to explain. In his heart, he carried no satisfaction of revenge, only the stillness of peace. He had done what he had decided. He had given his legacy to the one who cared for it and removed it from the one who had abandoned it. Now, there was nothing left to prove. He walked slowly through the house he had built with his own hands. Every wall carried a story. Every floorboard carried a memory. The laughter of children, the cries of hardship, the warmth of shared meals, and the silence of loneliness. All of it was etched into the home. But tonight, the house felt different. It did not feel like a home for a single person. It felt like a testament to what had been given and what had been lost. Outside the window, the wind blew softly through the trees. The old man watched the branches sway, the leaves dancing gently in the night air. The world had not changed, but he had. He had carried the burden of betrayal, and now he had let it go. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had been answered. Justice had been done in his way, not with anger, but with a quiet act of truth. He thought of his son. He thought of the 25 days of silence, the calls unanswered, the hope that had been denied. He thought of the son who had once held his hand and promised to stand by him, the son who had now turned away. There was sadness in the thought, but no bitterness. Bitterness is a fire that burns the holder. Peace is a river that carries the soul forward. He chose peace. His daughter came to him quietly that night. She did not speak much. She knew words were not needed. She understood the depth of what had happened. She had seen her father's patience, his sacrifice, and his heartbreak. She had seen the silence that spoke louder than shouting. She had seen the decision made with calm resolve. She held the legacy with both hands, knowing it was not just property, it was trust, love, and duty. The old man sat in his chair, looking at the night sky. He thought of the years ahead. There would be more days of quiet, more nights of rest, and more mornings of reflection. His legacy would live on, but not in the way he had once imagined. It would live in the hands of his daughter, in the care of those who respected it. His son would have nothing but the memory of silence and the weight of what was lost. The peace he now felt was not sudden. It was earned. It came from years of endurance, years of quiet giving, and years of being ignored. It came from the decision to act, not in anger, but in truth. It came from knowing that silence answered silence more powerfully than noise. His act was final, and with that finality came freedom. In the days that followed, the son did not return. The house was still filled with whispers. Relatives spoke softly about the decision, about the son who had been erased, about the father who had kept his word. Some were shocked, some sympathetic, but all understood one thing clearly. The father had acted with purpose. He had chosen the one who valued him. He had chosen justice over forgiveness when forgiveness had been denied. The father spent his mornings quietly in the garden. He watched the sunrise with his tea in hand. He thought about life, about sacrifice, about what it means to be remembered. He thought about the son who had turned away and the daughter who had stood by him. And he felt no regret. Regret is for those who look backward with sorrow. He looked forward with peace. He knew the son would carry guilt for the rest of his life. Guilt for silence. Guilt for abandoning the man who had given everything. Guilt for losing what could not be replaced. Guilt for being absent when it mattered most. That guilt would be the heaviest inheritance of all. And in that knowledge, the father found the peace he had longed for. The house was still filled with life, but the weight of what had been decided rested quietly in the air. The daughter carried the legacy with honor. The son carried nothing but silence. And the father carried peace. The peace of knowing that he had answered silence with truth, betrayal with justice, and neglect with a final act of love. He no longer feared the days ahead. He no longer feared the silence of an absent son. For he had learned something deeply true, that peace is born not from being heard, but from being understood. And he had made himself understood, not in noise or anger, but in the quiet power of his decision. The years moved on. The garden grew richer, the house grew older, and the father grew wiser. He sat often by the window, watching life pass by. He knew that what he had done would be remembered, not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of truth. He knew that his story would teach others that silence is a choice, and that sometimes the greatest justice is found in letting go. And so, in those quiet afternoons, he told himself he had done enough. He had given all he could give. He had passed his legacy to the one who valued it most, and he had left his son with the weight of his own silence. It was enough. The father understood now that life is measured not by what we keep, but by what we give. And he had given his legacy to love, not to neglect. He had given peace to himself, and a lesson to the one who refused to answer. And in that gift, he found the truest inheritance of all. His days grew slower, filled with quiet reflection. He walked gently, spoke softly, and carried no anger. His son had faded into nothing, and that absence was his final answer. The father had chosen silence, and silence had spoken louder than any word. In the stillness of his home, he thought of the 25 days, the unanswered calls, the quiet that had grown heavy like stone. He thought of the moment he had made the decision, of the strength it took to pass the legacy to another. And he knew that in that moment he had passed not just property, but truth. The truth that love must be chosen. The truth that respect must be earned. The truth that silence can betray louder than words. The truth that legacy is not given by blood alone, but by loyalty and care. He smiled softly, not at victory, but at peace. He had lived long enough to know that peace is the greatest prize, and he had won it. As he looked toward the window once more, he thought quietly to himself, "I gave my legacy to love, not neglect. I left guilt as the only inheritance for the one who turned away. And in that, I found my peace." And with that, the old man rested, knowing his story was complete. Now, as an old man, I tell this story calmly, without anger, without hate, without a desire to wound. My voice is softer now, my hands slower, my heart heavier with the years I have lived. I tell it not to gain sympathy, but so that someone, somewhere, might learn what I have learned. My story is a simple one, though it carries a weight that is deep. It is the story of betrayal, of silence, of heartbreak, and of choice. I tell it so that others might understand the truth I hold in my bones. I think often of my son. He was my blood, my flesh, my hope. I carried him when he was small. I worked so hard so that his life would be easier than mine. I gave him my strength, my sweat, my dreams. I told myself, one day, he would stand proudly with me. But I learned that love does not guarantee loyalty, that sacrifice does not guarantee respect, that patience can be mistaken for weakness, and that silence, when prolonged, becomes a wound too deep to heal. He refused to answer my calls for 25 days. 25 days of silence. 25 days when my heart called for a voice that never came. I did not know what he thought. I did not know if he cared. I only knew the pain of being left without an answer, of being treated as if I was invisible, as if I did not matter. I thought I had given everything to him. I thought that love alone could keep a bond alive. But I learned otherwise. Silence was his answer, and silence became my test. In those 25 days, I had time to reflect. I thought about all the years I had worked. I thought about the nights I went to bed hungry so that he could eat. I thought about the days I labored in rain and cold so that he would have a roof over his head. I thought about the times I bore illness quietly so that he would not worry, and I thought about what I had received in return. Not gratitude, not respect, but absence. Not love, but silence. That silence became heavier with each passing day. At first I hoped it was a moment of anger, something that would pass. I hoped he would call, he would answer, he would come back. But the days turned into weeks. His silence became a wall between us, a wall built not of stone, but of pride and neglect. And I realized that silence is not absence, it is a choice to abandon. And with that realization, my heart broke again, deeper than before. It was in that quiet pain that I made my decision. I decided that silence must be answered with action, not with shouting, not with violence, not with words that would fade into the air, but with truth. I called my lawyer. I spoke in steady words, though my hands trembled. I said my son was no longer my heir. I said that my legacy must pass to the one who valued it, to my daughter, the one who never abandoned me, the one who answered my calls, the one who stood by me. And so, I chose her. I remember the day I told her. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was calm. She did not boast. She did not speak of triumph. She only said, "I will care for what you have built." And I knew she would. She had carried my love without question, without silence, without hesitation. And so I gave her the legacy. I gave her my home, my land, my name. I gave her the years I had spent building for my family. And I took it away from the one who had chosen silence over love. When I announced it at the family gathering, there was a hush in the room. All eyes turned to my son, and I saw shame there. He stood silent. No words came. There was nothing left to say. He saw what his silence had done. He saw that absence had cost him everything. His pride was gone. His inheritance was gone. And I stood, quiet and steady, knowing my choice was right. Now, years later, I look back and I understand something deeply. I understand that a father's love is not only in what he gives, it is in what he protects. I protected my legacy. I protected my dignity. I protected the love that had been given without return. And I taught a lesson, not in words, but in action. A lesson that silence can betray louder than words. A lesson that neglect carries its own cost. I have learned that life does not always give us the justice we expect, but we can make justice for ourselves. We can choose to answer betrayal not with anger, but with truth. We can choose to protect what matters most. For me, what mattered most was my family, my home, my name, and when one child turned away, I gave it to the one who stayed. The years have given me peace. I do not wake with anger. I do not sleep with regret. I wake with the quiet knowledge that I have lived as I believed was right. I have learned that silence is not always peace, and noise is not always justice. That actions speak deeper than words. That the inheritance we leave behind is not always gold or land. It is the truth of what we stood for. My son carries his silence still. He carries the absence of what he could have had. He carries the weight of my quiet decision. I do not wish him harm. I wish him understanding. But understanding comes only with time, and perhaps it is a lesson that must be learned in loneliness. And I too carry something. I carry the peace that comes from making a choice that honors what I have built. I carry the quiet comfort that I have passed my legacy to one who values it. I carry the deep truth that I did not abandon my love for my son, but that he abandoned it first. Now, as I sit by the window and watch the days pass, I tell my story quietly. Not to boast, not to seek approval, but so that someone will hear and learn. So that someone will understand that silence can be the greatest cruelty, that neglect can cost more than loss, that legacy is not only in what is given, it is in who is chosen to carry it forward. My final thought is this. He ignored my calls for 25 days. I answered his silence by passing my legacy to another. I watched him fade into nothing. And in that silence, I found my answer. I found my peace. I found my truth. And now, as an old man, I tell this story so that it lives beyond me, so that my choice lives beyond my years, so that others may learn that love must be chosen every day, that respect must be earned every day, that silence can be louder than words, and that the greatest inheritance we can leave is the truth of our hearts. This is my story, my legacy, my lesson. He ignored my calls. I ignored his future.